Hi and welcome to my tutorial on needle turn applique with lots of tips to help you master this sometimes tricky technique. You're here because you signed up for my free PDF. If you haven't downloaded that yet, I will link it below in the description. Needle turn applique is one of my favourite techniques and I use it in a lot of my work, like in this quilt here, where out of the 20 blocks, 17 of them feature needle turn applique and each one of them was sewn by hand. I like the bold graphic quality it can give to each of the shapes, and it reminds me a little bit of paper cutouts, another favourite way that I like to work. The technique refers to a method of attaching a shape of fabric to a base cloth, and the raw edge of that fabric is folded under and then stitched down so that you cannot see any fraying and you're left with a nice bold and sharp edge. And you can, do some quite intricate shapes, and you can do something much more simple. But it's definitely a technique that takes a while to get used to. And when I began sewing with this, I found it so frustrating. I just couldn't get the shape that I wanted. And over time, I've sort of found a few things that have worked really well for me, and I wish I'd known those tips at the start. So hopefully some of these things will be useful for you too. If you know my work, or if you follow me on Instagram, you will know that I love to work with linen, but linen is quite tricky to manipulate with needle turn applique. There are many different types of linen, so this is obviously quite a thick and heavy weave compared to this one. I would never use this one. It's far too bulky. I'm not going to be able to turn that over and get nice precise shapes. The weave is also quite open. The individual strands are very, very thick. So if you are set on using linen, choose something that's finer and has a tighter weave. And even with this, you can see how the edges are fraying. I would probably save 100% linen for a bigger, less accurate shape, like a larger circle, rather than for a small detailed project. Cotton is much, much easier to work with. It's finer and the weave is much finer, and that's a good one to begin with. If you love the look of linen, you might want to try a linen cotton blend, and that's kind of the best of both worlds really. So you've got the look of linen and that nice texture that linen has, but more stability of cotton, so it doesn't slip around as much as linen will do, and it will still hold a shape quite nicely when you crease it. So the next thing you want to think about is the needle and thread that you're going to use. You can use a fine sewing thread if you want to make your stitches disappear. You would match the colour of the applique shape rather than the colour of the fabric to do that. Or if you want more pronounced stitches, pearl cotton is really lovely to sew with, and it's particularly nice because it's got a slight sheen to it. And that just helps, often knots will form as you're stitching, and it's just so much easier to unravel with this thread. And again, you can match the colour to the applique, or you can use a thread that contrasts. For this video, I will stitch with a thick contrasting thread so that you can see my stitches more easily, but I can show you some examples of some where the thread disappears as well. You want a needle that fits the size of your thread comfortably through the eye of the needle. Typically, I do a lot of my work with sashiko needles, great for hand quilting, slow stitching, but they are a little bit thicker because they're so strong. They're quite thick, so it might be too thick for needle turn applique, and it just makes it harder because you're sewing through a fold plus the background, so that's quite a lot of fabric to pull your needle through. So you want a finer needle. And I prefer a slightly shorter needle to ones that I use when I'm quilting, just because you're making quite a few short whip stitches and it's just generally easier to pull them through when it's shorter. But I don't have any advice for what size. If I'm honest, I just grab what I have to hand or what I can find. So I would just say experiment with what's comfortable for you to hold. When you're sewing, never take more than arm's length of thread If you try and do any more than that, you'll get into a tangle. I know this from lots of experience. So an arm's length of thread is all you need. And then you want to knot your thread. I use a quilter's knot. You can use any knot that you like, just to prevent those stitches from falling out. Okay, the thing that I'm going to say next, I wish someone had told me this when I started hand sewing. So hold your needle in your dominant hand. I'm right-handed. The needle is facing towards the left, so my sewing direction needs to be towards the left. If you sew the other way, you are sewing against yourself. It becomes really clunky, you get yourself in a mess. Sew in to the left if you're right-handed. If you're left-handed, sew to the right. That, I think, is probably the number one thing that people struggle with when they start needle turn applique. I will show you what I mean when I get started. Okay, so you've chosen your fabrics, you've chosen your needle. We're going to start doing some simple shapes. So we're going to start off with a square. I think straight edges are easier to begin with. You can just draw it out on your fabric, or you can make a very simple template. You are going to draw around your template on the right side of your fabric. So place your fabric the right side up and draw around. I'm using a Frixion pen, which is great. They disappear with heat, so I can draw on the fabric and then use a hairdryer or an iron to remove that. But as always, check on a scrap piece of fabric first. So we're going to draw around our template. I'm going to put that to the edge so I'm not wasting fabric. So with my template, there is no seam allowance included. So this line here that I'm drawing becomes the fold line. And I'm just going to cut around, leaving sort of about 0.5 centimetre. Now I can see already that this is a good choice of fabric because it's not fraying too much. So before I sew, I'm going to, with the pen side up, just finger press that along the line. So I'm going to go around and do that on all 4 sides. And this just makes it so much easier for the fabric to sit flat. And it's just less work for my needle to turn that over. When I drew around the template, I lined it up with the grain. And I'm going to place it on the grain as well. You don't have to, you could have it at an angle if you like, but I'm going to line this up. I'm going to leave it out like this. And then I'm going to use some pins to pin it down. I like these flat flower head pins because they don't kind of buckle your fabric as you're pinning. They are quite long and they're quite sharp though, so be careful. If it was a bigger shape, I would hand baste that down first. As I'm right-handed, I'm going to start on the right-hand side and I'm going to start at the top of the shape. So I'm going to fold that under, and I'm not quite going to go on that point. I'm going to just start around here. I'm going to bring the needle into the fold here, right on the line, so that my knot gets lost on the inside of that fold there. And then I hold it with my left hand and I use my thumb to hold down this line that's folded. Then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go into the backing fabric, and then I'm going to move it along parallel with this edge and just catch a bit of that fold with the needle. And you can see from behind that stitch goes across. So again, into the back, bring the needle across, level with the fold, come up a few millimeters and pull that through. Just be careful that your thread doesn't get caught on the corners or on any pins. So into the background, across, catching the fold, and then coming up. So I'm going to zoom that camera in so you can see a bit better. So my threads come up from the fold. I'm going into the background fabric, level with where that stitch has just come out, taking my needle across so it's parallel with the fold, catching the fold and bringing it up. So I'm going to take that pin out now. So into the background, across, catching the fold and up. So the pin's going in level with where the thread comes out. If you take it along, your stitches will be diagonal. You want your stitches to be nice and straight. And if we look at the back, then it forms nice neat stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch up to that corner. So every so often just check that you're not pulling the fabric too tightly or you're not pulling your stitches too tightly, because if you do, the tension of that is going to cause the fabric to wrinkle. So try not to pull them too tightly, but they want to be tight enough so that they're not sagging at the back and the top shape isn't lifting off. So think about your tension and try to hold that evenly as you're stitching. I've now got one more stitch until I get into this corner. So I'm going across and just careful to catch that corner like this. This time I'm going to go into the background and just pull it all the way through. So my stitch is just coming level with that corner into the back. Pull that all the way through. So now we want to turn the work, snip off a triangle here to reduce the bulk. And just encourage that to fold flat. So fold that down, just use your nails, just kind of poke that in. So that folds down nice and neatly. There we go, and then I can go ahead and work along this side of the square. So now I'm just bringing my needle back up. That's how my back is looking. So my stitches are fairly evenly spaced. I'm not measuring them, I'm not being too careful. Once you get used to this, you get into a kind of rhythm, and I think your hand just sort of remembers, just seems to know where to put the needle in and out. So my needle is holding that fabric in place. It could sort of, if I'm not careful, it could distort the shape around. So having a pin in or a few basting stitches will just prevent that from moving around. What can happen as well is that if you pull this too tightly, your background fabric can sort of bag out a little bit as well. So you want both top and bottom fabrics to sit nice and flat. So just check that when you pin as well. So it looks good from the front and from the back. Okay, coming to a corner. So I'm going right in the corner. Check in all my stitches. The tension is good. Going into the back again. Oops. Pulling that through. So open out, snip that corner, and then fold that through. So just take a moment to press the lines back down. So mine is trying to distort a little bit here, so I'm just taking a moment now just to make sure that's nice and flat. And also what you might see is I've got a few threads that are trying to poke out here. So I'm just going to use my needle to encourage those in. And then just sort of hold it down with my thumb. And then start stitching again on this side. So every 2 or 3 stitches, I'm stopping and just checking everything is where it should be, rather than stitching the whole shape and then realizing some of my threads are a bit not pulled tightly enough. It's easier to solve earlier on. Last 2 corners. So the back's looking nice. So this time I'm going to snip both of the corners down. So I've already snipped away this corner, so I'm just going to use my nail and the needle edge, needle tip, to just encourage those last little bits to go under and for that to sit in the right place without distorting out. That should be fine. So just carefully getting the corner. So you might notice I just used the table to push the needle through them, because the needle was going through quite a few layers of fabric. Okay, one last stitch. And then we go into the back. And now we just need to tie it off at the back so that our stitches don't come loose. So I'm just going to take it to the next stitch, and I use the wrong end of my needle to pull that through, just so that the tip doesn't get caught in between the threads. And I'm just going to put that needle under. Oops. and then just pull that to tie a knot. I'm going to do that one more time. So using the wrong end of the needle, put it under a stitch. Tie that off. Okay, and there you have a simple appliqué square. Now I'm going to take that over to an iron and all of the pen lines will disappear. What you can do as well, depending on what your intention is with this piece, this could be used as a mending, for example. So if you were covering a hole in a jacket or elbow or knees of trousers, then this would sit on top of that. You might want to go in and add some stitches to reinforce it. But if you were going to sew this into a quilt, and this would be layered over some wadding and then with a backing fabric, there's going to be quite a lot of layers there. So what I do is go back in, pull the top away from the background, make a little snip, and then I just cut out that backing fabric. And that just means later on when I hand quilt that, I haven't got lots and lots of layers of fabric to sew through. It just reduces the bulk, makes it much easier on your hands. And it also means I've got another little scrap to play with later, which most definitely will get used. Okay, so the next shape we're going to try is a circle. So I'm going to make a template for this again. Find anything to draw around or use a compass. So I'm going to show you a different technique this time. So I'm going to cut my circle a bit bigger than my template. You can do this exactly the same as before. You could draw around it and then use the line to fold against. Or you could try this technique. And what I'm going to do is sew a running stitch in the seam allowance and then pull it to gather it so that it pulls around this template, and then take it over to an iron and press it, remove the template, and then you'll have the already perfectly folded shape of the circle, and it will just help the gathers to sit in evenly and again just reduce that bulk. One of the hardest things about sewing a circle with needle turn applique is that you might start off with a nice smooth curve, but that fabric begins to gather around, and you soon get sort of to one side of the circle, and then you've got all of these sort of creases to contend with, and it's hard to get that to sit flat and to feed that under evenly. So this is one way of alleviating that problem. Gathering my stitches up on my needle. Okay, so place our circle inside and then come up. Oh, yes. Oh, how satisfying is that? Pull that around. So pull that as tightly as you can. Just going to knot that in. So you can already see how neat now that circle shape is. Okay, so that's obviously a really big seam allowance. So I can just go around and just snip that a little bit smaller. So you can see that it's becoming a little bit angular where those threads where those folds are overlapping. So I would just go in and just snip that, just to help that to sit nice and flat. If you are right-handed, you're going to sew anti-clockwise. If you are left-handed, you're going to sew clockwise. So use your thumb, and as I did before, going into the background. Now I didn't draw the circle on, so I'm just using the fold as my guide. So I just like to go around and press it with my nail every so often, because the fabric does like to sometimes jump back. And it's helpful lining up the grain, because you can see if it begins to distort that your grain isn't matching. So that's another little visual indicator that you're not quite holding your fabrics together, or you're pulling it too tightly, or that somehow it's shifted somewhere. Let's check the back. That's lining up nicely. It's not too loose, and it's not buckling at the back. So I can see it's starting to look a bit angular there, so I'm just going to carefully unfold that and then just snip it, just to encourage that to fold down. Okay, let's get into this last little bit. So I can see this is trying to poke out, so again I'm just going to use my sharp bit of the needle to just pull that under, encourage it to lie flat. Whoops. Final stitch into the back. There we go, I'm happy with that one. So again, using the wrong end of the needle, go into the back of the next stitch and then sew into that loop to make a knot. Okay. So it's a little uneven at the top there, but I think that's not bad. Quite happy with that. Neat from the front and from the back. So you can see the difference in having more visible stitches and stitches that kind of disappear into your background. The next shape I'm going to show you is a heart, because it has straight edges, curves, inside points and outside points all in one shape. Draw yourself a template as we did before and cut it out of your fabric, leaving a seam allowance. Then go around and fold along your drawn line. When you have finished folding along the lines, place your fabric onto your background, line up the grain and pin in place to prevent it from moving. It's easier to begin at the straight part. I think if you start on a curve, you're going to have to start tucking under straight away. If you start at a point, then that's kind of hard to work out where, moving the bulk around. So let's start on a straight bit. Remember, if you're right-handed, you'll work around in a clockwise direction. If you're left-handed, you'll work in an anti-clockwise direction. And as before, starting off in that fold. So I'm going to begin just holding that folded edge down with my thumb and forefinger, and then sewing in exactly the same way as we did before. Now, as I get up to this curve, I'm just going to start to fold that fabric under. So if it's just a slight curve, you shouldn't need to snip into it. When the curve gets deeper, then you can start snipping. So I usually do 2 stitches and then readjust the fabric. You start to get a feel for when you need to turn that over. So this is needle turn applique. I'm not always using my needle to turn the edges because I've pre-folded it with my fingers. But what's happening is, as I put my needle under and up and then back down, that downward stitch is kind of holding the fabric in place. So that's why it's important to make sure your stitches are nice and tight, good tension, so that fabric doesn't start to lift back up. So turning that under, and that's sitting nicely because I've already folded it. So this top fabric's actually quite fine, so I might get away without having to snip it at all, but I will have to snip it once we get into the centre there. There's some simple rules to follow, but you just need to kind of feel your way through. So rules are there as a guideline, but you can obviously bend them. So as the curve's tighter, I'm just having to readjust that fabric more frequently to make sure that the fold is sitting along the line. Okay, so I'm going to struggle to fold that bit under now because this bit needs to be slipped into. So I'm going to just stop slightly short of where the line is, and then I have to be very careful now because if I start to pull this, that's going to fray. So I'm just being very, very gentle. It can help to put your stitches a little closer together, just to encourage that shape to sit nice and flat. And this is where you need to use your needle to begin to turn that under. So I put my stitches closer together as I'm getting towards the inside point of the heart. And I'm encouraging any frayed edges to just go under. So you will get a neater result here if you use a finer thread. And you can certainly disguise any sort of frayed edges by stitching closer together with a finer thread. So I'm sewing a little stitch to the side of the point, then just sewing underneath my pen mark right in the middle and going back in. Then on the other side of that point, very close to it, coming up and then going around and starting to encourage this side of the heart to sit nice and flat. Again, putting my stitches quite close together here on this inside corner. So that's the most difficult bit out of the way. I'll just see if I can hold that a little closer to the camera so you can see. So stitches are very close together, and there's 3 stitches just in where the heart dips, and then they can get further apart as they come around here. And then from behind, looking quite neat. Continue sewing around the heart, folding and snipping as you go along to allow it to sit flat. Okay, so we've just got this straight edge to do. And I'm going to just snip this corner off now, while there's still enough room to do that. And that will just help this point sit nice and flat. Okay, on the tip, so it's already folded over nicely. Just going to use my needle to just make sure there's no threads poking out. I'm just going to go, I'm going to do 2, both slightly to the side of the tip. So 1, coming back up through the same hole. And coming back up quite close, so they're a little closer together again in the corner. So that holds that down. And then last few stitches to finish that off. And then we're just going to iron so that the pen disappears. I'll just go ahead, iron on the other side as well. So there we have our 3 applique shapes in order of difficulty, square, circle and heart. So I hope you have found that a useful tutorial. As for what to do with these, I mean, you may want to just keep them as practice samples. You could go ahead and bind them and make them into mini quilts like I've done here. So fill it with some wadding and a bit of backing fabric. Or these might make lovely patches to sew on clothing. I know my daughter would probably like that design. So there's loads and loads of things that you can do with it. And once you get used to these shapes, you know, there's endless possibilities. You can try something a bit more challenging, like a star shape, for example. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe, and you might be interested in some of the other digital downloads and video tutorials in my range. Head over to www.rebeccajohnston.co.uk to take a look, and don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter to find out about the latest releases.